So I'm going to read. In town, in Darwin, she'd always been daughter of. It was all when it came to her relative. A strange thing, recognition by association, at once flattering and diminishing. Teachers taking attendance on the first day of school asking obsequiously, "Are you by chance related to Louis Dempsey?" Flora reddening, nodding, conceding, "My dad." The recognition more embarrassing even than those unpronounceable hyphenated names so many of her classmates had been saddled with. "This town won't be the same without him," Gus had offered. Was that true or something one said? Her father had a prominent place in Darwin as president and then president emeritus. As scholars went, he'd been known, a populist critic he'd been called by admirers and detractors alike. His first book, Reader as Understander, tracing the history of how poetry, from Shakespeare to Stevens, was read in its day, sold well, and not just among rivals and graduate students. It won awards and accolades. It had become a book club favorite. At once learned and mass market. People who did not read poetry had read his book, or at least bought it. Within the confines of the town, her father's life had been quite public, and so his death had been public. A sudden public death made people vulnerable, aware of the risks of living. No one liked that kind of awareness, or the people who provided it. Who knew they might be contagious? Perhaps the town was relieved he was gone, the last of the Dempseys finally purged, though there she was, another one popping up like a rogue mushroom that refuses to be rooted out. Or was all that just narcissism? Again, self-important or self-deprecating. Was the notion of being reviled more palatable than the thought of being like so much in life, simply tolerated? To most people who had known her father, his death was likely like any other. A cause for sadness, but sadness on a normal scale. The town would be the same for him. It had been over a year since she'd returned to Darwin, though weeks ago she'd come close, as far as the hospital outside of town with her mother to see the body. She had needed to see him, needed to see that he was really dead. Her nerves jittered like she didn't know the etiquette. Hysterics seemed appropriate, but didn't arrive. As her mother stood beside her, she tried to remember the last time the three of them had been alone in a room together. A long time ago, another life. It was uncomfortable, it had long been, to have the two of them in the same place, and she didn't like her mother to see her father not looking well. Perverse, but that was her thought. His body to his neck was covered with a half blanket, half tarp, and his neck and earlobes were ruddy from the recognition impossible to avoid, freezer burn. But it was her mother who had touched him first, who had put her hand on his hair in an affectionate way and said, "Oh, Lou," as if he'd gone and done something truly unreasonable. And so Flora saw that she could press her mouth to his forehead and feel the terrible coldness of his changing skin and not regret not having done it. "Do you want to be alone with him?" her mother asked. And Flora told her no, and then she asked, "Do you want to cut a piece of his hair?" And the thought of asking the staff for scissors filled Flora with worry, as if they might suspect her of some barbaric act. But it turned out her mother had a tiny pair in her purse, and she cut the hair, which was a soft gray that moved toward a yellowish white and still wavy. Her mother said that, still wavy, and Flora had been thinking the same thing, though why still? Why would death have straightened his hair out? And Flora had signed the paper she needed to sign, and they had turned back to the city, away from Darwin. There was the Darwin College Chapel, an imposing stone fortress, its delicate white steeple like an ill-fitting cap, where in a matter of weeks his memorial would be held. The same chapel her parents had brought her to as a child to hear the undergraduate a cappella groups perform their wildly harmonized renditions of Yesterday, and I heard it through the grapevine. The same chapel that held the annual holiday Vespers, in which celebration Flora, a self-declared agnostic from the age of 6, had once read a short excerpt from the Gospel of Luke. The same chapel where her father had hosted academic forums on the poet as prose artist and the fantasy echo she had heard at the time, and assumed that was an important term of poetry, the fantasy echo, like a chorus or refrain, but more mysterious and ghostly. The same chapel where he had mourned other dead scholars over the years, and yet not the same, those memories long layered there, less convincing now the eulogizer was to be eulogized. Had it really been he who'd done such things, who'd been there all along? He'd been a wonderful speaker, witty and canny, with the easy appearance, though a false one, of off-the-cuffness. He always prepared. He could work a room, her mother would put it, but that was unfair. He was the same with everyone he met, and this authenticity radiated and pulled people in toward him. Flora felt herself so changeable and found that quality in him miraculous. She even felt she looked different from day to day. Something about her face hadn't yet gelled. Herself hadn't gelled. To be so constant, so reliably oneself, what would that look like? What would that feel like? Was yourself something you became? Had he been like that himself, even at her age? Flora wound her way around the two oldest dorms built in the early 1800s, north and south, here and there, her mother had called them. Humble red brick twins, and down to College Hill, which offered the best views of the mountains, and in winter, the best sledding. A dip at the foot sent you flying above your sled, and then, at the moment of reunion, thudding painfully back to earth. As a child, the pain had been part of the fun, falling under the category of pain-pleasure, like a loose tooth you trouble with your tongue, or like the time she and Georgia had given themselves paper cuts, tracing the lines on their palms and fingers till they were red and raw. Her father had been a mountains man when it came to views. Flora went more in for oceans. He'd loved this hilltop and walked here with larks most mornings. The range ringing the valley that was Darwin was densely wooded with bands of late fall orange amid swaths of evergreens. Flora was struck by its ruggedness, its wildness. Even cushy Darwin could seem remote. Going to the country was like going back in time, seeing how the world looked before it changed. A windbreakered father and daughter appeared beside her, he with a camera strapped around his neck, she with the eager expression of a college hopeful. He asked if Flora would take their picture before the view. "Are you a student here?" the father asked as they posed together, inches of green and orange visible between them. "I love it," Flora said, lowering the camera. "A beautiful campus," he said, "and quiet. Everyone busy studying, I guess. Or sleeping off their hangovers," Flora said. The girl released a nervous, knowing laugh. The father reached for his camera. Down the hill on the old clay tennis courts, two well-bundled men Flora identified as assistant professors were hitting stiffly back and forth in the chill, as if their primary goal were to move in the smallest radius possible. What day was it? She was losing track already, not hard to do in Darwin. On the other side of the courts was a small wooded area with a path running through called the Bird Sanctuary, where she had gone on gloomy walks with her father as a girl. And on the other side of the Bird Sanctuary stood the small house she had shared with her mother after they left the president's house. A grim walking tour it was. The assistant professors waved, not necessarily out of recognition, but because waving was the done thing. She felt a sudden urge to perform for them, to do a cartwheel, or to lift her clothing and flash her breasts, to shock, to make a fool of herself. But she'd exhausted suddenness. She simply returned the wave and then turned and followed the road back toward her father's house, a walk her father had taken countless times on his way to and from the courts, until his knees betrayed him a few years back and he had to stop playing. She could see him in his ancient sweats, the racket held at his side, rising every so often to map out a stroke. It was as if she had done nothing her whole life but make a study of his movements. Her father shaking hands, a slow, graceful greeting, not at all the firm spasm meant to convey power, throwing his head back in laughter as he tried to get through a joke he loved, reading while walking from car to house, anticipating when the slate steps began, and reaching for the handrail without lowering his book, listening to music, choral, orchestral, surging, holding his hand up as if to draw her attention to the surge, transported, nearly tearful, staring at her mother in overt contempt. And now here they were, the images, reminding her of all she'd learned, what she had to show for the long work of growing up.